Economic Report of the President, together with the Annual Report of the Council of Economic Advisers. January 2021. Contents. Economic Report of the President. 1. The Annual Report of the Council of Economic Advisers. 9. Introduction. 13. Part 1. Confronting the largest post-war economic shock. The federal response to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic. Chapter 1. Creating the fastest economic recovery. 35. Chapter 2. Prioritizing America's households. 69. Chapter 3. Assisting entrepreneurs and workers through aid to businesses. 89. Chapter 4. Advancing the quality and efficiency of America's healthcare system. 113. Part 2. The Renaissance of American Greatness. Chapter 5. Assessing the early impact of opportunity zones. 145. Chapter 6. Empowering economic freedom by reducing regulatory burdens. 173. Chapter 7. Expanding educational opportunity through choice and competition. 199. Chapter 8. Exploring new frontiers in space policy and property rights. 225. Chapter 9. Pursuing free, fair, and balanced trade. 251. Part 3. An effort to rebuild our country. Chapter 10. The year in review and the years ahead. 287. Chapter 11. Policies to secure enduring prosperity. 319. References. 395. Appendix A. Report to the President on the activities of the Council of Economic Advisers during 2020. 435. Appendix B. Statistical tables relating to income, employment, and production. 447. For a detailed table of contents of the Council's report, see page 23. Economic Report of the President. To the Congress of the United States. 4 years ago, on the steps of the United States Capitol, I pledged to the citizens of this country to return our nation to greatness, and to thereby enable, secure, and enhance the prosperity of all Americans. While this would require us to confront challenges and hardships, I knew that the American spirit, set free from overbearing taxation and regulation, would drive the country forward to unimaginable economic success. I was right. Over the course of this administration, the American people demonstrated an indomitable will to prevail and drove our economy to record heights. Since my first day in office, I have been steadfast in my commitment to put America first. The economic pillars of this movement, sweeping tax reform, extensive deregulatory actions, and fair and reciprocal trade agreements, promoted a robust middle class and led to the longest expansion and strongest recovery in history. Before the coronavirus came to our country from China, our economy created more than 7 million jobs, nearly 12,000 factories returned to our shores, and wealth for Americans hit all-time highs. Inequality decreased as wage growth for blue-collar workers outpaced that of their managers, and earnings for those in the bottom 10% grew faster than earnings for the top 10%, reversing the trends of past administrations. Since the start of my administration, median household income grew by more than $6,000, lifting up people no matter their race, ethnicity, educational background, or age group. In 2019 alone, median household income rose $4,400, more in 1 year than in the entire 16 years through 2016. Even as more than 2 million people returned from the sidelines to enter the labor force, the unemployment rate plummeted to 3.5% in February 2020, the lowest level in more than half a century. This past year, our nation has faced trials the likes of which many have never experienced. Through these challenges, however, we have witnessed once again the resilience of the American people. In just 2 months this year, more than 23 million people saw their livelihoods threatened through no fault of their own, as the unemployment rate peaked at 14.7%. Since this spring, we have seen more than 12 million jobs return and gross domestic product increase by a record-shattering 33% in the third quarter alone, thanks to the largest and fastest economic policy response in history. When the virus hit, my administration launched the largest industrial mobilization since World War II. We have created the world's most innovative testing system, pioneered groundbreaking therapies and treatments. And, most importantly, we have developed and manufactured gold standard vaccines in record time. The pandemic may have begun in China, but we are ending it in America. Thanks to the pro-growth policies of my administration, our nation's economy has exceeded expectations at every turn, and despite the economic shock due to the China virus, our great American comeback is well underway. The Renaissance of American Greatness, Rebuilding Our Country. For decades, political leaders and privileged elites worked to silence American workers and families even as opportunity, and with it hope, slipped from the shores of our great nation. Almost 5 million manufacturing jobs and 60,000 factories fled our country following the establishment of permanent normal trade relations with China in 2000. Massive tax burdens and overregulation encouraged businesses to invest elsewhere. For decades, multinational corporations flooded our nation with imported goods, stripping millions of American families of their livelihoods and their dignity. Decades of these damaging policies led to the prevalence of "Made in China," as China's leaders and those from other countries took advantage of establishment politicians who did not have the best interests of American workers at heart. Before I took office, politicians and their adherents to a globalist doctrine converted our borders and national sovereignty into mere negotiable concepts to be traded away or simply ignored when in conflict with establishment interests. Anti-American ideology flooded into schools, universities, and media, while American wealth, intellectual property, and innovation rushed out of our country. Cities corroded by years of neglect and mismanagement became commonplace, each complete with an allotment of lawless streets that were devoid of prospect, educational choice, and liberty. International financial crises became matters not of if, but of when, yet the attention of those charged with governing turned elsewhere and the American people were forgotten. Since taking office, rather than apologize for America, I have stood up for America. From day one of my presidency, I have put America first, and I have fought for the American worker harder than anyone ever has. My administration has adhered to the two simple rules of Buy American and Hire American. We have built the most secure border in history, and I took the toughest ever action to stand up to China. I have worked every day to restore promise to our nation through an economic agenda that lifts up all Americans. In just 3 years, my administration's policies brought more than 6.6 million people out of poverty, created prosperity through record low unemployment rates for Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and those without a college degree, reduced homelessness among the general population and our veterans, and saved thousands of lives by stemming the tide of opioid-related deaths. We committed to breaking a cycle that for too long held children's education hostage on the basis of affluence and class background, denying children knowledge and unrealized potential. And my administration returned economic freedom to the American people as we have cut nearly 8 regulations for every new, significant rule, weakening the power of the regulatory state and stifling stealth taxation. The power of fracking has forged the path for American energy independence and delivered personal prosperity alongside national security, contributing to a 10% decline in the global price of oil. We also created the U.S. Space Force, the 6th branch of the military, and have given new meaning to peace through strength, by expanding our capabilities and restoring American leadership in space. We unleashed record prosperity at home, while also negotiating fair and reciprocal trade agreements. The passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act increased wages for blue-collar workers, and the implementation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement elevated American competitiveness with respect to our regional trading partners. We took the toughest, boldest, and strongest actions against China in American history, and the United States is now collecting billions of dollars in tariff revenue on imports of Chinese goods. I took unprecedented action to reduce drug prices and ensure that Americans never pay more for life-saving medicines than consumers in other countries. And my administration took action to end surprise medical billing. We also eliminated the harmful individual mandate from the so-called Affordable Care Act, as between 1.2 and 4.6 million Americans gained employment-sponsored health coverage from 2018 to 2019. These actions, along with countless others taken by my administration, have not only boosted economic growth and wage gains for all Americans, but they have also protected the American people from foreign competitors trying to take advantage of them. A great American comeback underway. The virus from China required us to close up the greatest economy in the history of the world. Understanding the risks our nation faced, I took bold action to ban travel from China and then later Europe, saving countless American lives. In a matter of days and weeks, the global economy ceased to exist as we knew it. Nations around the world locked down as uncertainty generated tremendous fear. In order to prepare our frontline responders in hospitals and health facilities across the United States, we prioritized the safety of the American people over the strength of our economy. In March of this year, we implemented an initial plan to slow the spread of the virus, in coordination with governors across the nation. During that time, my administration facilitated the delivery of thousands of ventilators and millions of gloves, masks, and protective gear to states and territories, working to get Americans life-saving medical equipment. We promised that no patient suffering from the virus would have to pay for their treatment out of pocket, and we provided billions of dollars to hospitals and healthcare providers so that uninsured patients would have access to critical care. By the end of March, the Food and Drug Administration issued emergency use authorizations to fast-track more than 20 diagnostic tests and life-saving treatments. Thanks to our efforts, the case fatality rate today is more than 85% lower than its April peak. Meanwhile, Operation Warp Speed has harnessed the innovation of the private sector to develop and manufacture millions of doses of life-saving vaccines, decreasing the average development time from 3 years to less than 9 months. This record-shattering work has cleared the path for an end to this cruel pandemic, saving millions of lives around the world and trillions of dollars in health and other economic costs. Through no fault of their own, Americans from all walks of life have been forced to confront the invisible enemy. To help the nation through this difficult time, I championed and signed 4 pieces of legislation. These laws kept Americans connected to their jobs and reduced the economic harm to families and workers. In March, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security (CARES Act), the largest piece of economic relief legislation in history, authorized direct payments to citizens, expanded unemployment insurance, and deferred loans for those who needed it most. When Congress later abdicated its duty to expand and extend this relief, for short-sighted political gain, I signed 4 executive actions to continue providing for the families, students, and workers of our country. Additionally, my administration worked hand in hand with the private sector, invoking the Defense Production Act and related authorities more than 100 times to surge production and distribution of ventilators, protective equipment, and other materials, including therapeutics and vaccines. The Paycheck Protection Program, a core piece of the CARES Act, saved or supported more than 51 million American jobs by providing more than 5.2 million critical loans to small businesses. These loans were crucial lifelines to business owners and their employees that averted widespread bankruptcies. This effort alone meant that more than 80% of March and April layoffs were temporary, as over 80% of these businesses that received them are still open today. In addition, economic impact payments sent to more than 159 million Americans surged liquidity to every corner of our nation, and provided nearly 3 months of income to households in the bottom 10% of the income distribution. And our Farmers to Families Food Box program delivered more than 90 million boxes to families, children, and businesses, protecting millions of Americans from food insecurity. For the last 4 years, I have fought for you, the American people, in all that I do. The economic report of the president that follows describes the policies that have made our country so successful and lays out steps we can take to continue the great American comeback in response to the China virus. This year's report is a testament to the resolve of the American people, who never falter in the face of adversity, and whose courage and relentless drive forge our destiny. The White House, January 2021. The Annual Report of the Council of Economic Advisers. Letter of Transmittal. Council of Economic Advisers, Washington, January 15, 2021. Mr. President, the Council of Economic Advisers herewith submits its 2021 annual report in accordance with the Employment Act of 1946, as amended by the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978. Sincerely yours, Rachel Seidenschner-Slobodian, Chief of Staff. Introduction. In 2020, the U.S. economy experienced its worst macroeconomic shock since the Great Depression. As a direct result of the arrival of COVID-19, and consequent measures to contain and mitigate viral transmission, real output was on pace to contract by as much as 12.3% in 2020, which would have constituted the worst economic contraction since 1932. Professional forecasters projected that the unemployment rate would reach as high as 25.0% in May 2020, its worst level since the Great Depression and more than twice its peak in the aftermath of the 2008-9 global financial crisis. The Congressional Budget Office (CBO) forecasted a contraction of almost 6% during the 4 quarters of 2020, and that the unemployment rate would remain over 11% through the end of the year. In the face of this exogenous economic shock of historically unprecedented scale and speed that abruptly terminated the U.S. economy's record expansion, the Trump administration responded with equally unprecedented scale and speed. As a result of this response, real gross domestic product (GDP) in the 3rd quarter of 2020 was down 3.5% from its pre-pandemic level, less than half the drop in the early projections and high-frequency forecasts. Figure I-1. Actual GDP versus May 2020 CBO projection. Figure I2. Actual payroll employment versus May 2020 CBO projection. For the fourth quarter imply a calendar year decline of 2.3%, less than one-third the projected decline. Figure I1. In 7 months, the U.S. labor market recovered 12.3 million jobs, or 56% of job losses in March and April. Figure I2. The unemployment rate declined from a peak of 14.7% in April to 6.7% in November, almost 5 percentage points below the year-end unemployment rate projected by the CBO in May. After peaking at 22.8% in April, U6, the broadest measure of labor market underutilization, had declined to 12.0%, a level lower than that of July 2014, more than 5 years into the previous recovery. Aided by unparalleled fiscal support for households, by July 2020 retail and new and existing home sales had regained their pre-pandemic levels. The COVID-19 pandemic brought to an end the longest economic expansion in recorded U.S. history, which, for the first time since the 2008-09 financial crisis, was exceeding expectations and delivering real economic gains across the income and wealth distributions. Figure I3. In the 3 years before the pandemic, the U.S. economy added 7 million jobs, 5 million more than projected by the nonpartisan CBO in August 2016. In the first 2 months of 2020 alone, the U.S. economy added more jobs, 465,000, than the CBO projected would be created in the entire 12 months of 2020. Figure I4. Through 2019, real median household income rose $6,000, more than 5 times total gains under the preceding 8 years, while wage, income, and wealth inequality declined, and the wage gap between African Americans. Figure I3. Actual GDP versus August 2016 CBO projection. Figure I4. Actual payroll employment versus August 2016 CBO projection. Figure I5. Initial unemployment insurance (UI) claims, 2020. And white Americans narrowed. After landmark tax reform in 2017, real wealth for the bottom 50% of households had risen 3 times faster than that of the top 1%, while real wages for the bottom 10% grew almost twice as fast as for the top 10%, marking stark reversals from the preceding expansion, when wage, income, and wealth inequality all rose. Although wealth rose across the income distribution, the bottom 50%'s share of real net worth increased, while that of the top 1% decreased. Labor's share of income rose, and capital's share decreased. In February 2020, just before the pandemic hit in force, the unemployment rate declined to 3.5%, its lowest level in more than 50 years, and a full 1.5 percentage points below the CBO's final 2016 forecast. COVID-19 constituted an exogenous shock that abruptly terminated this record expansion, though it was met with a similarly swift policy response. Within a week of the first reported COVID fatality, Congress passed, and President Trump signed into law, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. Within 4 weeks, the president signed into law 2 more pieces of economic legislation, including the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security (CARES Act, which provided $2.2 trillion in direct financial support to American firms, households, medical facilities, and state and local governments. These historic policy responses to the adverse shock of COVID-19, as well as the historic strength of the pre-COVID U.S. economy. Figure I6. Index of Household Income by Percentile, 2020. Mitigated what was on pace to be a macroeconomic contraction on par with the Great Depression. In particular, measures designed to preserve employer-employee relationships, most significantly the Paycheck Protection Program (PPP), and Employee Retention Tax Credit, played a key role in allowing firms to retain workers on leave. By limiting eligibility to small and medium-sized enterprises, the PPP targeted aid to those employers that were most at risk of needing to terminate employees. Figure I5. Meanwhile, income replacement and cost mitigation helped to cushion the shock to household incomes and thereby facilitated stabilization and recovery of consumer spending, which alone constitutes 70% of the U.S. economy. Federal assistance programs, including expanded and enhanced unemployment insurance and economic impact payments to households earning below set income thresholds, largely offset declines in household compensation due to economic shutdowns. Income replacement rates were highest at the lower end of the income distribution, indicating that relief was targeted toward households that were more vulnerable to an adverse income shock. Figure I6. Upon expiration of these provisions and in the absence of congressional action, the Trump administration extended further relief through 4 executive actions, providing supplemental payments through lost wages assistance to unemployed Americans, temporary payroll tax relief, and extended relief and protection for student borrowers and renters at risk of eviction. Figure I-7. Labor market recovery comparison by recessions. Though the pace of the recovery vastly exceeded expectations and constituted the most rapid economic recovery on record, Figure I-7, in the face of the continuing global COVID-19 pandemic, U.S. employment and production remained below pre-pandemic levels at the end of 2020. Recognizing the remaining challenges to full economic recovery, most importantly the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the administration supports and consistently supported additional fiscal relief, including an additional round of the PPP to support small business payroll retention, an expanded employee retention tax credit, a continuation of enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, a second round of economic impact payments, targeted aid to schools and state and local governments, additional nutritional support, and temporary relief to specific adversely affected industries. At the time of this writing, the U.S. Congress had not agreed to these measures. In Chapter 1 of this report, we discuss the historic economic gains in the United States on the eve of the pandemic, before quantifying the magnitude of the economic shock that hit the U.S. economy in 2020 and situating this shock in historical context. In Chapters 2, 3, and 4, we then document and estimate the economic effect of the administration's response to the shock, focusing first on households and labor markets, then on business and financial markets, and finally on healthcare. We then turn, in the next 5 chapters, to the role of pre-COVID-19 administration policies, specifically in the areas of opportunity. Zones, deregulation, school choice, space innovation and exploration, and international trade, in establishing the foundations for longer-run potential economic growth. Finally, we review the U.S. economy in 2020 and discuss the economic outlook, including potential risks, before concluding with a discussion of potential future policies to promote further economic recovery and subsequent growth. In Chapter 1, we document that the beginning of 2020 ushered in a strong U.S. economy that was delivering job, income, and wealth gains to Americans of all backgrounds, with historically low unemployment and poverty along with record gains in median income for workers across the socioeconomic spectrum. Moreover, the robust state of the economy led forecasters to expect healthy growth through 2020 and beyond. However, the arrival of COVID-19, with origins in the People's Republic of China, brought with it an unprecedented economic and public health crisis. This chapter describes the health of the pre-COVID Trump economy and the nature of the economic shock from COVID-19, and gives an overview of the swift and bold fiscal response undertaken by the Trump administration to provide relief and lay the foundation for the most rapid economic rebound to date in modern U.S. history. We analyze these issues in greater depth in Chapter 2. We find that the Trump administration's pro-growth policies contributed to substantial gains for U.S. households between 2016 and 2019. Median net worth increased by 18%, median income increased by 9.7%, and poverty reached a record low. As the COVID-19 pandemic brought the historic expansion to a potentially catastrophic halt, the Trump administration helped protect the livelihoods of Americans through legislation and executive actions. Even as the unemployment rate climbed from a 50-year low of 3.5% in February 2020 to a record high of 14.7% in April, household incomes increased across the distribution, especially for lower-income households, thanks to economic impact payments and expanded and enhanced unemployment insurance. Protections against evictions and student loan defaults helped keep people in their homes and out of default. The ultimate success of these efforts will depend on how quickly the economy recovers. Between April and November, the unemployment rate fell by 8.0 percentage points, the fastest 6-month decline on record, paving the way to attaining the same strong economy that prevailed during the first 3 years of the Trump administration. Chapter 3 analyzes the effects of the economic policy response on businesses and employer-employee ties. The CARES Act, which was signed into law by President Trump only 2 weeks after he issued a national emergency declaration, provided record economic relief to families and businesses to mitigate the shock from the COVID-19 crisis. In total, the fiscal response to COVID-19 stands out as the most rapid and robust crisis-related economic policy mobilization in the post-World War II era. 2 central objectives have constituted the Trump administration's approach to combating the economic fallout from COVID-19, the alleviation of financial distress to reduce hardship, and the preservation of underlying economic health to facilitate a faster recovery. Ensuring the vitality and resilience of small businesses plays an essential role in achieving these objectives. This chapter describes the fiscal relief provisions aimed at helping small businesses and their workers, principally the PPP, and their success in fueling what has been thus far the fastest employment and GDP rebound in U.S. history. In Chapter 4, we examine how the COVID-19 pandemic constituted a rapidly evolving health and economic crisis in the healthcare sector and for working families across the nation. The Trump administration's response to address this multifaceted crisis involved a complementary two-pronged policy approach. First, by enacting several pieces of bipartisan legislation, the administration secured significant funding to alleviate the financial burden experienced by hospitals, offered tax credits to private employers with fewer than 500 employees to enable them to provide emergency paid family and sick leave for their workers, and fully covered the cost of COVID-19 testing and treatment for many low-income and uninsured individuals. Second, through a series of deregulatory actions, the administration expanded the use of telemedicine for both COVID-19 screenings and many other health concerns, supported the relaxation of occupational licensing requirements for nurse practitioners, issued emergency use authorizations for COVID-19 diagnostic tests, and accelerated the development, authorization, and deployment of therapeutics and vaccines for COVID-19. This included the administration's Operation Warp Speed, which the C estimates could result in as much as $2.4 trillion in economic benefit through the accelerated availability of an effective vaccine. This chapter explores the various effects of these healthcare policy innovations and achievements, some of which are likely to pay dividends after the COVID-19 pandemic is resolved. Beginning with Chapter 5, we discuss the role of pre-COVID administration policies in establishing the foundations for longer-run potential economic growth. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 not only broadly lowered taxes for businesses and individuals but also made targeted cuts to spur investment in economically distressed communities designated as Opportunity Zones (OZs). This chapter compares the advantages of OZs with those of other federal anti-poverty programs and documents the characteristics of the nearly 8,800 low-income communities designated as OZs. The C finds that $75 billion has been invested in funds for OZs, and that this investment is already benefiting Oz residents and potentially having only a small effect on the current federal budget. In Chapter 6, we revisit the issue of economic regulation. During the Trump administration, federal agencies have demonstrated a sustained commitment to regulatory reform. As a result, the administration's regulatory efforts have helped reduce red tape for small businesses and middle-income households. One of the most important deregulatory actions the administration finalized in 2020 is the Safer Affordable Fuel Efficient (SAFE) Vehicles Rule, which we estimate will lead to an increase in real incomes and raise GDP by $53 billion annually, or about 0.3%. The C also finds that the benefits of deregulations, such as the Safe Vehicles Rule, tend to favor the lower income quintiles, suggesting that lower income households may have benefited the most, relative to household income, from the administration's deregulatory actions. In Chapter 7, we examine the topic of school choice. During the past 30 years, school choice programs have undergone dramatic expansion in the United States. These programs, organized at the federal, state, and local levels, share a common goal of expanding access to education options that exist alongside and ultimately improve public school options for primary and secondary education. The programs have altered primary and secondary education in fundamental ways by increasing competition in the school system and by enhancing educational opportunities for all students, especially those from disadvantaged groups. We document the development and expansion of school choice programs and discuss the role of federal policy, including recent actions by the Trump administration to further this expansion. We explain how educational competition empowers families and incentivizes schools to deliver more value, and we document the growing empirical evidence that carefully crafted school choice programs do improve educational outcomes for all students. Chapter 8 analyzes important developments in a frontier of economic potential, namely, innovation and opportunity in the space economy. We review advancements in spaceflight and space policy made during the past year, including the first commercial human spaceflight in history and implications for the private sector's role in the space economy. We also discuss the role of the administration's policies, specifically the executive order on encouraging international support for the recovery and use of space resources, and the Artemis Accords, in strengthening investor confidence in the space economy and thereby enabling expansion of the private space sector. After an extensive review of the economic theory of property rights and the empirical property rights literature, we find substantial evidence that improving investor expectations in a novel economic sector such as space increases investment in that sector. In addition, we estimate that private space investment could as much as double in the next 8 years, due to the administration's executive actions and other enhancements of property rights in space. In Chapter 9, we examine how the administration has promoted U.S. interests in international trade by forging new bilateral trade agreements with China, Japan, and South Korea, and reshaped regional trade by modernizing the trade agreement with our most important trading partners, Canada and Mexico. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement achieves new safeguards for U.S. interests across a range of areas including digital services, intellectual property, and labor protections. These agreements go well beyond formal tariff barriers that have been the focus of past trade agreements by addressing structural and technical barriers to free and fair trade. We also review how the COVID-19 pandemic reduced international trade overall and has brought into focus underappreciated risks of global supply chains. In Chapter 10, we build on Chapters 1, 2, and 3 by summarizing the main macroeconomic developments of 2020, and discuss the economic outlook for the years ahead, with particular attention to upside and downside risks. We find that though the U.S. economy in 2020 was hit with the biggest adverse macroeconomic shock since the Great Depression, with effects on output, labor, capital, housing, and energy markets all of historic magnitudes, the subsequent recovery to date has also been of historic speed, breadth, and magnitude. We highlight that though official and private forecasters currently project continued strong recovery in 2021, aided by an unprecedented economic policy response in 2020, a strong pre-COVID economy, and the availability of vaccines through Operation Warp Speed, substantial risks remain, including both pandemic and policy risks. In the near term, the single greatest downside economic risk is rising COVID-19 cases before the widespread availability of vaccines, and the policy and behavioral responses to viral resurgences. Already, in December 2020, several state and local governments have reimposed shelter-in-place orders in response to rising cases in November and December. For this reason, the administration continues to articulate support for additional fiscal measures to provide a bridge to the widespread availability of vaccine candidates developed under Operation Warp Speed. Over the longer term, failure to maintain or implement the types of pro-growth policies discussed in this report and in the 2018, 2019, and 2020 editions of the Economic Report of the President would constitute additional potential downside risks. But the continuation and expansion of the administration's pro-growth policies in support of full labor market recovery offer the upside potential for a rapid return to the levels of employment, production, and real income growth that prevailed on the eve of the pandemic. We conclude this report, in Chapter 11, by reviewing a collection of policy areas highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we analyze reforms that might meet the ongoing economic challenges faced by the United States. In particular, we review potential policies to strengthen connections to the labor force, support a balance between work and family, advance international coordination to address 21st-century challenges, create a more effective healthcare system, build a dynamic economy through infrastructure improvement, and generate a more skilled and resilient workforce. We find that solving these challenges can ensure that the United States not only recovers to its pre-pandemic levels of prosperity but also builds a fairer, more dynamic, and more resilient economy that benefits all Americans. Contents. Part 1. Confronting the largest post-war economic shock. The federal response to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic. 33. Chapter 1. Creating the fastest economic recovery. 35. The historic strength of the U.S. economy before COVID-19. 39. The early economic effects of COVID-19. 45. The U.S. economy's resilience in weathering the COVID-19 shock. 51. Comparing the COVID-19 recession and the Great Recession. 52. The state of the economy before the crises. 53. The origins and progression. 55. Fiscal and monetary responses. 56. Federal support for low-income households. 60. Conclusion. 67. Chapter 2. Prioritizing America's households. 69. The strength of the pre-COVID economy and the COVID-19 shock. 72. Policy responses providing household relief. 74. March 2020 legislative acts. 74. President Trump's executive actions. 76. The impact of policies in providing relief to households. 77. Spurring a return to the pre-COVID economy. 84. Conclusion. 86. Chapter 3. Assisting entrepreneurs and workers through aid to businesses. 89. Summary of policies to assist American businesses and their workers. 91. The Paycheck Protection Program. 91. Employee retention tax credits. 91. Economic injury disaster loans and advances. 92. The Federal Reserve's lending facilities. 92. Other programs. 92. Measuring small businesses' utilization of selected CARES Act business provisions. 93. Comparing expected and actual small business bankruptcies during the COVID-19 pandemic. 97. The CARES Act's role in facilitating small business survival. 101. The Coronavirus Food Assistance Program's impact on farm incomes. 105. The pandemic's impact on the financial sector and lending facilities role. 106. Conclusion. 110. Chapter 4. Advancing the quality and efficiency of America's healthcare system. 113. Expediting research and development for novel therapies and tests for COVID-19. 118. Emergency use authorizations. 118. Operation Warp Speed. 119. Supporting the healthcare system. 123. Deregulation. 123. Financial support for healthcare providers. 124. Subsidizing beneficial behaviors and the cost of COVID-19 care. 127. Emergency paid sick and medical leave. 128. Subsidizing the cost of COVID-19 care. 128. COVID-19 and future healthcare reform. 129. FDA reform. 130. Telemedicine deregulation. 134. Scope of practice deregulation. 137. Additional changes to promote choice and competition. 140. Conclusion. 141. Part 2. The Renaissance of American Greatness. 143. Chapter 5. Assessing the early impact of opportunity zones. 145. Comparing opportunity zones with other anti-poverty or place-based programs. 149. Anti-poverty transfer policies. 149. Federal place-based policies. The New Markets Tax Credit Program. 150. Other federal place-based development programs. 152. Characteristics of opportunity zones. 153. The opportunity zone selection process. 153. The economic state of opportunity zones. 154. Opportunity zones' effect on total investment. 157. Capital raised by qualified opportunity funds. 157. Estimated investment growth caused by the opportunity zone incentive. 160. The industry focus of qualified opportunity funds. 162. Opportunity zones' effects on business investment and housing values. 163. Equity investments in opportunity zone businesses. 163. Opportunity zone designation and housing values. 164. Opportunity zones' effects on poverty and the budget. 168. Projected effects of opportunity zones on poverty. 168. Budgetary effects of opportunity zones. 168. Conclusion. 170. Chapter 6. Empowering economic freedom by reducing regulatory burdens. 173. Regulation in review. 176. The Safer Affordable Fuel Efficient (SAFE) Vehicles Rule. 178. GHG credit transaction data. 180. Estimating the curve for the marginal cost of compliance. 182. The potentially regressive nature of regulation. 186. Progressive and regressive tax structures. 186. The harm regressive regulation systems pose. 188. Lower income households often gain the most from regulatory reform. 193. The regressivity of federal regulation offsets the progressivity of federal taxes. 196. Conclusion. 198. Chapter 7. Expanding educational opportunity through choice and competition. 199. Overview of school choice programs and federal policy. 203. Private choice programs. 204. Public choice programs. 206. Examples of school choice. 207. The role of federal policy in school choice. 210. School choice and competition. 214. Competition between school districts. 214. Designing school choice systems. 215. Evidence on the impact of school competition. 217. Direct value added effects. 217. Indirect pro-competitive effects. 220. Conclusion. 222. Chapter 8, Exploring New Frontiers in Space Policy and Property Rights, 225. Current Issues in Space Policy and the Space Economy, 228. Space Policy Developments, 233. The Economics of Property Rights, 235. Historical Examples of Property Rights Evolution, 237. Investment Responses to Property Right Enhancement, 238. The Effects of Policies on Investment in Space Industries, 242. Looking Ahead, 245. Flag of Choice, 245. Incentivizing the Private Sector, 246. Conclusion, 249. Chapter 9, Pursuing Free, Fair, and Balanced Trade, 251. The Phase 1 Agreement with China, 254. Background, 254. Major Provisions, 256. Intellectual Property, 256. Technology Transfer, 257. Agriculture, 257. Financial Services, 259. Currency, 259. Chinese Purchase Commitments, 260. Dispute Resolution, 261. What is not in Phase 1, 262. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, 263. Rules of Origin for Automobile Production, 263. Digital Trade, 264. Intellectual Property Protection, 264. Labor, 265. Reform of the Investor-State Dispute Mechanism, 265. Agricultural Provisions, 266. Trade Facilitation, 267. Overall Economic Effects, 267. Other Trade Agreements, 268. U.S.-Japan Trade Agreements, 269. The U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, 269. Limited Trade Agreements with Brazil and Ecuador, 270. U.S.-UK Negotiations, 270. The Rise of Global Supply Chains, 271. China and the Emergence of Global Supply Chains, 271. U.S. firms begin to hedge the risks of global supply chains, 272. The trade slowdown in response to COVID-19, 272. The decline in imports of intermediate goods, 276. Evidence that firms are reducing their exposure to China, 277. Drivers of shifting supply chains, 281. Conclusion, 282. Part 3, An Effort to Rebuild Our Country, 285. Chapter 10, The Year in Review and the Years Ahead, 287. The Year in Review, 288. Components of Economic Output, 288. The Labor Market, 293. Inflation, 296. The Housing Market, 296. Financial Markets, 300. Interest Rates, 302. Oil Markets, 303. The Global Macroeconomic Situation, 303. The Future Economic Outlook, 305. Forecasts from the Blue Chip Consensus, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, 307. Economic Objectives and Policy, 307. Near-term upside and downside risks, 311. Long-term upside and downside risks, 314. Conclusion, 316. Chapter 11, Policies to Secure Enduring Prosperity, 319. Strengthening Connections to the Labor Force, 321. Dual Earner Couples, 322. The Marriage Penalty and the Second Earner Penalty, 324. Tax Reforms to Mitigate the Second Earner Penalty and Boost the Labor Supply, 327. High Marginal Rates for Low Earners, 328. Supporting a Balance Between Work and Family, 334. Unequal Access to Paid Family and Medical Leave, 336. Effects of Paid Leave on Employment and Earnings, 338. Implementation of Paid Leave, 339. The Lack of Childcare, 342. Increasing Access to Childcare, 343. Enhancing International Coordination to Meet 21st Century Challenges, 345. The Economics of Networks, Coordination, and Standard Setting, 346. The Current Paradigm for Coordination and Standard Setting, 348. Opportunities for Advancing Coordination, 351. Prospects for US-UK coordination. 352. Creating a more effective healthcare system. 353. Rationalizing the provision of healthcare professionals. 354. Balance billing. 356. Medicare inpatient rates. 358. Building a dynamic economy through infrastructure improvement. 359. The federal government's role in infrastructure investment. 359. Infrastructure and productivity. 362. The costs of building infrastructure. 365. The critical importance of user fees. 366. Investing in port infrastructure. 373. Generating a more skilled and resilient workforce. 378. Points-based immigration. 378. Estimated economic benefits. 378. Estimated effects on the wages of domestic workers. 382. Estimated effects on government revenue and expenditures. 384. Improving post-secondary education and skill development. 385. Increasing incentives for schools to improve the economic gains of students. 386. Improving support for educational programs that promote skill development. 388. Conclusion. 392. References. 395. Appendixes. A. Report to the President on the activities of the Council of Economic Advisers during 2020. 435. B. Statistical tables relating to income, employment, and production. 447. Figures. I-1. Actual GDP versus May 2020 CBO projection. 13. I-2. Actual payroll employment versus May 2020 CBO projection. 14. I-3. Actual GDP versus August 2016 CBO projection. 15. I-4. Actual payroll employment versus August 2016 CBO projection. 15. I-5. Initial unemployment insurance (UI) claims, 2020. 16. I-6. Index of household income by percentile, 2020. 17. I-7. Labor market recovery comparison by recessions. 18. 1-to-1. Evolution of 2020's gross domestic product forecast, 2020. 38. 1-to-2. Real gross domestic product fell and rose more sharply now than during the Great Recession. 38. 1-to-3. The unemployment rate versus pre-election forecasts, 2011 to 2019. 40. 1-to-4. Real median household income by householder race, 1967 to 2019. 42. 1-to-5. Share of total net worth by percentile, 2007 to 2019. 43. 1-to-6. Poverty rates by race and Hispanic origin, 1959 to 2019. 44. 1-to-7. U.S. real gross domestic product, 2014 to 2019. 44. 1-to-8. Percentage of the U.S. population under statewide restrictions, 2020. 46. 1-to-9. Retail spending during the early stages of the pandemic, 7-day average, 2020. 47. 1-to-10. Traffic congestion during the early stages of the pandemic, median across all states, 7-day average, 2020. 48. 1-to-11. Seated diners in U.S. restaurants, per OpenTable, during the early stages of the pandemic, 7-day average, 2020. 49. 1-to-12. Weekly U.S. hotel occupancy rate during the early stages of the pandemic, 2020. 50. 1-to-13. Percent change in small businesses that are open and hourly employees who are working in the early stages of the pandemic, 2020. 50. 1-to-14. Unemployment and COVID-19, the Trump economy versus the 2016 counterfactual, 2020. 52. 1-to-15. Ratio of household sector and non-financial business debt to gross domestic product, 2006, Q4 2020, Q2. 54. 1-to-16. Timelines for the fiscal and monetary responses to COVID-19 and the financial crisis, 58. 2-to-1. Monthly disposable personal income, 2020. 78. 2-to-2. Index of household income by percentile, 2020. 79. 2-to-3. Index of household income for example households, 2020. 80. 2-to-4. Percent below federal poverty line, 2019-2020. 81. 2-to-5. Household receipt and use of economic impact payment, 2020. 82. 2-to-6. Evictions in selected cities by month, 2020. 83. 2 to 7. Eviction filings in select cities, 2020. 83. 2 to 8. Labor market recovery comparisons by recessions, 1945 to 2020. 85. 2 to 9. Private payroll job losses by sector since February 2020. 86. 3 to 1. Share of total PPP loan counts and PPP loan amounts by round, 95. 3 to 2. Percentage of small businesses receiving a PPP loan, through August 8, 2020. 97. 3 to 3. Total Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings by U.S. small businesses, 2020. 98. 3 to 4. Percent change in small business Chapter 11 bankruptcies, fiscal year 2020, from fiscal years 2017 to 2019 average, 99. 3 to 5. Small business Chapter 11 bankruptcies, fiscal years 2008 to 2020, 100. 3 to 6. Actual versus predicted small business Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings, 2007 to 2020. 101. 3 to 7. Change in the number of small business hourly employees working, 2020. 103. 3 to 8. Change in the number of small businesses open, 7-day average, 2020. 104. 3 to 9. Change in small business revenue, 7-day average, 2020. 104. 3 to 10. U.S. net farm income, 2016 to 2020. 105. 3 to 11. Dow Jones Industrial Average change during various pandemics, 107. 3 to 12. Market Volatility Index, VIX, 2007 to 2020. 109. 3 to 13. BBB Corporate Bond and 10-Year Treasury Note, Spread, 2006 to 2020. 110. 4 to 1. Percentage of U.S. population under statewide restrictions, 2020. 117. 4 to 2. Daily health and economic costs of COVID-19 to the United States if no vaccine is found, 121. 4 to 3. Value of speeding up a COVID-19 vaccine starting September 1, 2021. 122. 4 to 4. National Medicare utilization, January 10 to October 30, 2020. 126. 4 to 5. Monthly employment by sector, 2020. 127. 4 to 6. Average drug life cycle during patent period, 131. 4 to 7. Average annual social surplus by approval time decrease, 133. 4 to 8. Cumulative aggregate net present value of increased social welfare by approval time decrease, 133. 4 to 9. State scope of practice deregulation, 139. 5 to 1. The geography of opportunity zones, 153. 5 to 2. Demographics of Opportunity Zones, OZs, 2012 to 2016. 155. 5 to 3. Average median household income by census tract designation, 2000 to 2016. 155. 5 to 4. Average median household income by tract designation and state, 2012 to 2016. 156. 5 to 5. Population by poverty rates and census tract designation, 157. 5 to 6. Growth in qualified opportunity funds, Novogradac and SEC data, 159. 5 to 7. Opportunity Zone OZ Investment Supply and Demand Model, 162. 5 to 8. Percentage of qualified opportunity funds, by industry, 163. 5 to 9. Private equity investment by tract group, 2016 to 2019. 165. 6 to 1. Significant final rules excluding deregulatory actions, by presidential years 2001 to 2019. 177. 6 to 2. Vehicle market equilibrium with GHG standards, 179. 6 to 3. GHG credit market equilibrium for various standards, 183. 6 to 4. Consumer savings from the Safe Vehicles Rule as a percentage of income, by income quintile, 185. 6 to 5. Illustrative impact of a 15% grocery tax, by income quintile, 187. 6 to 6. The impact of regulation in a competitive market, 189. 6 to 7. Percentage of income spent on outlay category, by income quintile, 189. 6i. Economically significant final rules with regulatory flexibility analysis for small businesses, by presidential years 2001 to 2019. 190. 6-8. Individual mandate penalties as a percentage of income, by income quintile, 192. 6-9. Consumer savings on Internet access from the Restoring Internet Freedom Rule, by income quintile, 194. 6-10. Consumer savings from selected deregulatory actions and the Safe Vehicles Rule, by income quintile, 196. 6-11. Consumer savings from deregulatory actions compared with the federal tax rate, by income quintile, 197. 7-1. Number of ESSs, vouchers, and tax credit scholarships, 1996 to 2020. 201. 7-2. Enrollment in public choice programs over time, 202. 7-3. Percentage distribution of students age 5 to 17 years attending kindergarten through 12th grade, by school type, 1999 and 2016. 203. 7-4. Federal funding per student for public primary and secondary schools by state, 2016-2017. 211. 7-5. Number of charter schools opened, 2006 to 7 to 2016-2017. 212. 8-1. NASA outlays in U.S. private investment, 2010 to 2019. 229. 8-2. Non-governmental equity investment in commercial space companies, 2010 to 2019. 231. 8-3. Marginal cost and benefit of property rights specification, 237. 8-4. Non-governmental equity investment in commercial space companies in the United States, 2010 to 2028. 244. 9-1. U.S. imports, 2020. 273. 9-2. U.S. exports, 2020. 273. 9-3. U.S. imports of goods, percent change from selected countries, 2020. 275. 9-4. U.S. imports of goods from the world by type of good, 2020. 278. 9-5. U.S. manufacturing import ratio, 2008 to 2019. 280. 9-6. U.S. near to far ratio, 2009 to 2019. 280. 9-7. Average monthly nominal wages in U.S. dollars, 2000 to 2020. 281. 10-1. Components of real GDP, 1990 to 2020. 289. 10-2. Consumption and wealth relative share of disposable personal income, DPI, 1952 to 2020. 290. 10-3. Components of investment, 1990 to 2020. 291. 10-4. Government purchases as a share of GDP, 1948 to 2020. 293. 10-5. Unemployment rate, 1990 to 2020. 294. 10-6. Labor force participation rate, 1990 to 2020. 295. 10-7. Nominal compensation and earnings for private industry workers, 2006 to 2020. 295. 10-8. Consumer Price Inflation (PCE) Price Index, 2012 to 2020. 297. 10-9. U.S. Housing Price Index, 1990 to 2020. 297. 10-10. U.S. New housing formation and single-family home sales, 1990 to 2020. 298. 10-11. U.S. homeownership rate, 1990 to 2020. 299. 10-12. Percentage of rent payments made, 2019-2020. 300. 10-13. Market Volatility Index (VIX) 2007 to 2020. 301. 10-14. 10-year minus 3-month Treasury constant maturity rate, 1990 to 2020. 302. 11-1. Employment to population ratio, 1960 to 2020. 322. 11-2. Distribution of joint filers, 1962 to 2019. 323. 11-3. Average tax rate on the pre-tax wages of single persons and second earners without children, 2020. 325. 11-4. Average tax rate on the pre-tax wages of single persons and second earners with children, 2020. 326. 11-5. The marginal effective rate on low earners, 329. 11-1. Pre-TCJA distribution of MIDs by adjusted gross income, 330. 11-2. Pre-TCJA distribution of SALT by adjusted gross income, 332. 11-3. Homeownership rates in high-tax areas compared with low-tax areas, 2018 to 2020. 333. 11-6. Change in employed workers with actual hours lower than usual hours, by family type, 2020. 335. 11-7. Access to paid leave by average wage, 337. 11-8. Cost of paid family and sick leave as a share of state wages, 2019. 341. 11-9. The free movement of health care labor, 2020. 355. 11-10. Percent change in Medicare FFS-DRG payments compared with Medicare Advantage and private insurers, top 25 diagnosis-related groups, 2015. 359. 11-11. U.S. productivity, 1949 to 2019. 363. 11-12. Number of seaports by country among the top 50 busiest seaports in the world, 2018. 375. 11-13. Cargo volumes of the Port of Seattle compared with the Port of Prince Rupert, 2015 to 2018. 376. 11-14. Share of permanent legal immigration based on employment, 2017. 379. 11-15. Estimated educational attainment of recent immigrants aged 25 years and older, 2016 to 2018. 381. 11-16. Employment by educational attainment, 385. 11-17. Average federal, state, local, institutional, or other sources of grant aid awarded to undergraduate students, 2010 to 2018. 386. 11-18. Growth in four-year public and private universities expenses by selected category, 1997 to 2018. 388. 11-4. Composition of student body population by income quintile, 389. 11-5. Comparative rates of return for a four-year degree, 390. 11-6. Comparison of real cumulative median net earnings, 391. Tables. 1-1. Growth in earnings, 2009 to 2020. 41. 1-2. The federal response during the Great Recession and COVID-19. 59. 1-3. Funding of major workforce program initiatives under the America Reinvestment and Recovery Act, 2009. 62. 3-1. Liquidity programs for small businesses during COVID-19. 94. 3-2. PPP loan size by amount, first and second round combined data as of August 8, 2020. 94. 3-3. PPP loans by industry, 96. 4-1. Estimated social surplus by FDA approval time reduction, 2025 to 2040. Billions of real 2019 dollars. 134. 5-1. The effect of Opportunity Zone designation on home value appreciation, 167. 6-1. Selected deregulatory actions annual impact on real income, 195. 7-1. Demographics of CSP-funded schools and district public schools, 2016-2017. 213. 8-1. Composition of global space economy, 2019. 230. 8-2. Summary of effects of property rights improvement, 243. 9-1. U.S. tariff actions against China, 2018-2019. 255. 9-2. U.S. bilateral trade deficit with China in goods and services. 255. 9-3. Agriculture Phase 1 Agreement Provisions. 258. 9-4. Additional U.S. exports to China on top of the 2017 baseline. 260. 9-5. The impact of Canada and Mexico increasing de minimis thresholds. 266. 9-6. U.S. employment sector effects of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. 267. 9-7. Effects of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement on U.S. trade. Percent changes relative to the baseline in 2017. 267. 9-8. Imports and exports of services by sector, through September 2020. 274. 9-9. U.S. imports, change from 2019 levels for selected countries and regions, by type of good, through October 2020. 277. 10 to 1. Cumulative real gross domestic product losses through 2020, Q3. 305. 10 to 2. Economic forecasts, 2019 to 2031. 306. 10 to 3. Policy inclusive economic projections, 2019 to 2031. 308. 10 to 4. Supply side components of actual and potential real output growth, 1953 to 2031. 310. 11 to 1. Congressional FMLA tax proposals, 339. 11 to 2. Annual cost of paid parental and medical leave by take-up scenario. Billions of dollars. 340. 11 to 3. Durations of GATT-WTO rounds. 349. 11 to 4. Congestion pricing initiatives worldwide. 371. 11 to 5. Lawful permanent resident (LPR) status obtained by broad class of admission, fiscal year 2018. 379. 11 to 6. National income increase from a merit-based immigration system. 382. 11 to 7. 75-year net present value of fiscal benefits from proposed changes to the permanent legal immigration system. Billions of dollars. 384. Boxes. 6 to 1. Effects of regulation on small businesses. 190. 7 to 1. The Supreme Court's Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue decision. 205. 7 to 2. The School Choice Now Act. 214. 8 to 1. Public-private partnerships for human spaceflight. 232. 8 to 2. National security in space. 247. 9 to 1. Bahrain's and the United Arab Emirates agreements with Israel. 268. 11 to 1. Limiting tax expenditures to facilitate pro-growth reform. The SALT plus MID. Deduction. 330. 11 to 2. Continuing the historic health information technology modernization started during COVID-19. 360. 11 to 3. 5G infrastructure. 364. 11 to 4. Reforming the NEPA process. 367. 11 to 5. Digital infrastructure. 372. 11 to 6. Historically black colleges and universities. 389. Part 1. Confronting the largest post-war economic shock. The federal response to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic. Chapter 1. Creating the fastest economic recovery. The beginning of 2020 ushered in a strong U.S. economy that was delivering job, income, and wealth gains to Americans of all backgrounds. By February 2020, the unemployment rate had fallen to 3.5%, the lowest in 50 years, and unemployment rates for minority groups and historically disadvantaged Americans were at or near their lowest points in recorded history. Wages were rising faster for workers than for managers, income and wealth inequality were on the decline, and median incomes for minority households were experiencing especially rapid gains. The fruits of this strong labor market expansion from 2017 to 2019 also included lifting 6.6 million people out of poverty, which is the largest three-year drop to start any presidency since the War on Poverty began in 1964. These accomplishments highlight the success of the Trump administration's pro-growth, pro-worker policies. The robust state of the U.S. economy in the 3 years through 2019 led almost all forecasters to expect continued healthy growth through 2020 and beyond. However, in late 2019 and the early months of 2020, the novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19, with origins in the People's Republic of China, began spreading around the globe and eventually within the United States, causing a pandemic and bringing with it an unprecedented economic and public health crisis. Both the demand and supply sides of the economy suffered sudden and massive shocks due to the pandemic. During the springtime lockdowns aimed at flattening the curve, the labor market lost 22.2 million jobs, and the unemployment rate jumped 11.2 percentage points, to 14.7%, the largest monthly changes in the series' histories.